In my last video, we explored the most mysterious enemy in Elden Ring, the Lookout Stones. We revealed the identity of their creators and their actual name. We even got Fextra to change the name on the wiki, though the URL and header still need updating. And over the course of that search for the most mysterious, there were other enemies we saw who were similarly shrouded in ambiguity, namely the Wormfaces and the Cemetery Shades. The Wormfaces technically have less in-game text reference, but thanks to their actions, placement, and particular design, there is actually a bit of readily available lore about what kind of beings they are. So in this video, I want to look at the other entropic black hole of information. Peering into the shadows, let's see what light we can shine onto the enigmatic keepers of Death's Door. Let's delve into the lore of the Cemetery Shades. In alignment with their names, the Cemetery Shades are found in catacombs and hero graves. We can find them 3 times as boss fights and 1 time as a normal lesser enemy in the Gelmir hero's grave. This one is special because it drops the Mantis blade, the weapon of choice for our shadowed subjects. In this item we find the only text reference or description of these enemies in the entire game. It reads, "A curved sword with a blade at both ends wielded by the Cemetery Shades, the insect-ridden gravekeepers. The blade is thin and sharp, and strong attack unleashes a far-reaching slash." There are 2 important takeaways here. The first is the name, Mantis Blade, but I'll come back to that one later. The second is the description of the Shades as insect-ridden gravekeepers. As we generally find the Shades as final bosses of catacombs, the title of Gravekeeper makes sense. They in some way serve as guards and/or keepers of the graves they inhabit, looking after things and attacking those tarnished who would intrude. But they are also called insect-ridden, which gives reason for us to take a closer look at the enemies themselves. Zullie the Witch already has a really good video taking a close-up of the Shades, so I'll just briefly touch on it here. If we look at the top of the Shades, we will notice what looks like a large spider or crab sitting atop their heads. Zullie notes that the mesh of this creature is referred to as crab, and that it does resemble a spider crab. Now it's normally not something very in focus during our fights with the enemies, but we can see the cranial creature take a more active role during one of the Shade's special moves, where it bundles up and shoots a green web and then grab attacks us. Considering the underside of the crab spider is glowing like the eyes of the Shade, and the fact that thematically it looks like a parasite controlling the Shade's brain, we can probably be safe in surmising that this creature is the true enemy, controlling the Black Shade. This gives a straightforward reason as to why the Mantis Blade refers to the Shades as insect-ridden. And I just realized while reading this script that insect-ridden could be a double entendre of being full of insects, or also ridden by an insect, considering the crab spider is on top and kind of riding the Shade. And to touch on one more note from Zullie's video, there is a multivariate connection here to Godwyn and those who live in death. Deathroot is found in at least one of the Cemetery Shade areas, the Black Knife Catacombs, a place of deep connection to Godwyn through the Black Knife Assassins. The Deathroot is described as a source that gives rise to those who live in death, and the presence of death is an unavoidable aspect of the Cemetery Shades. They certainly seem to be in like kind with the other undead of the game, from their black intangibility to suffering a weakness to holy damage, and there is also their ability to disappear and teleport. It's obviously quicker, but I feel compelled to compare it to the teleporting of the Tibia Mariner. 2 foes that give Deathroot also having the ability to teleport just reeks of connection to me. Plus, there is the aquatic theme of the Mariner being a mariner, which we could say connects to the crab parasite of the Shade. Crabs and water are relatively connected, I'd say. And we see another possible branch of connection in the crabs in Altus Plateau, those infected by death and marked with Godwyn's face. They are a different kind of crab than the parasite crab, more river than spider, but the overall similarities in situation do stand. With all of the small connections, plus another environmental synchronicity we will see later, I would stake out that a tie between the Cemetery Shade and Godwyn's death presence is inarguable. It is just what form this takes that is left up to interpretation. Is the parasite a result of death, or simply something which latched on to a gravekeeper already imbued by death's touch? Either could be likely due to the great closeness between any gravekeeper and the realities of death. After all, no one would be more surrounded by the dead than one charged with looking after them and their graves. We see a clear relationship with death. So now let's return to the first point of note I mentioned, the name of the Shade's weapon, the Mantis Blade. The word Mantis will be our focus as it names an insect order, technically called Mantodia or Mantodea, which includes thousands of species, notably the European mantis, more commonly known as the praying mantis. I must first point out that this is another general insect connection. This is, after all, the item which describes the shades as insect-ridden, so it's unsurprising that the blade itself will bear an insect-themed name. But when I first recognized that the mantis blade has mantis in its name, I was immediately struck by a connection. A praying mantis looks kind of like another enemy in Elden Ring, the kindred of rot. They don't look exactly the same, obviously, but an overall shape of similarity, or just a shared vibe, seems to be there, to me at least. And this connection might be more than just a similarity pulled out of my head, since one of the Cemetery Shade bosses has as its item drop the Kindred of Rot Ashes. Right off the bat is the connection I already mentioned given some actual meat. But even more, the Rot Ashes describe the signature move of the Kindreds, or Kindred, in which they attack by, quote, secreting sticky threads. The style of the attack, along with the description of sticky threads, is pretty reminiscent of the attack we saw from the Cemetery Shade parasite, a secretion of green webbing. These parallels make it too hard for me to not believe in some deeper connection between the Shade parasite and the Kindreds. Perhaps they were originally from the same family or order of insects, only to be influenced by different elements and aspects of the lands between, one death and the other rot. And now they have evolved into the different states that we find them in-game. We know the Kindreds are categorically connected to rot. It's in the name and plenty of descriptions. We can even read about it in the same Kindred of Rot Ashes we already looked at. The rest of the description reads, the Kindred of Rot are the servants of the goddess of rot, servants that have been forsaken. And there's also their weapon, the Pest's Glaive, which, like the Mantis blade, gives some exposition about its handlers. Reading, wielded by the pests who emerged from the swamp of Aeonia. This glaive also shares some design similarities to the Mantis blade. They both showcase a curved blade with holes behind the edge, not to mention that their insect-based naming convention is alike too. We have Pest's Glaive and Mantis blade. They sound phonetically similar and they have the same formula of insect's name weapon type. I think this is another point of evidence to the Kindred and Crab Parasite being from the same family. Their weapons chart how a core similarity followed different paths of development and ended up as distinct weapons. The Kindred are creatures which came out of a swamp of rot, following the blooming of Millennia's Scarlet Aeonia. Maybe before the explosion of rot, the Kindreds would have been insects somewhat similar to the Cemetery Shade crab spider. Or maybe they would have been more like what the crab spider was before it came into contact with death. Obviously these are big areas of speculation, but now that we have some seemingly concrete connections, it's up to speculation to figure out how these things could have been connected. As this is one of the most loreless enemies in the game, we are by design going to have to be making a few reaches and stretches if we hope to say anything substantial about the Shades. As the Shades and Kindred are now, it is hard to note any connection between the rot and the death aspects. The Shades only do bleed damage after all. So I think using what connections we have to theorize about a possible shared past is a good option, since the enemies seem fairly distinct now, but their similar attacks and weapons may hint at a shared historic evolution. Looking at the rest of the boss loot, the other Cemetery Shade drops aren't immediately intriguing. They are comprised of more ashes. The Twin Sage Sorcerer Ashes and Lutel the Headless. If there's another way to pronounce the LH in Lutel, please let me know in the comments. The Twin Sage Sorcerers seemed completely random. Like From Software had a drop they needed to fit somewhere in the game, and Cemetery Shade 2's loot spot was just unfilled. On the other hand, Lutel the Headless has a bit more of relevance as she has connection to death and graves. Her ashes read, Spirit of a Headless Knight who leads the Mausoleum Soldiers, wields a lance enrobed in death and hurls spectral lances at foes. Lutel sacrificed her life so that, in death, she could continue to protect a soulless demigod until their revival, earning her the hero's honor of Erdtree burial. So this is a fitting item to drop from a Cemetery Shade, where connections to death and graves abound, including a specific and notable connection of protection to the progenitor of death in the lands between, the soulless demigod Godwyn. Lutel receiving an Erdtree burial makes it more fitting that her catacomb would have a shade to stand as gravekeeper. But beyond this, I don't know if there is much to draw about the Shades. Perhaps this could lead us to believe that they Shades were employed to guard important graves, or that the crab spider takes over its host near areas or entities important to Godwyn and death in general. If we look at the locations of the cemetery shades, they seem fairly random in terms of overall map location. However, one is in Lutel's catacombs and another is in the Black Knife catacombs, and both of these have connections to Godwyn. I can't see how the lesser shade in the Gelmir hero's grave has much significance, but the final boss version, which drops the kindred ashes, is placed in Caleb, which is fitting, and further intertwines the crab spider and the kindred to me. It seems unlikely at this point that they wouldn't have some evolutionary connection. And if we go with the parasite being the associate of death, then we may be able to explain some of its appearances and explore the Black Knife connection in more depth. It could have appeared in Lutel's catacombs to defend a servant of Godwyn. It could have appeared in the Black Knife catacombs to hunt or maybe keep locked away the assassin who bore the Black Knife print, an essential item in the plot which killed Godwyn. The presence of a Black Knife assassin as a second secret boss in a catacomb with a cemetery shade makes for quite the piece of environmental storytelling, and it seems impossible to me that we are not supposed to draw some conclusion from it. And we also see a headless mausoleum knight like Lutel guarding the entrance to this catacomb. With all of this, I am compelled to think of the cemetery shade as either a parasite hunter or a guard, ensuring the assassin will forever be trapped, as punishment for their crime. The catacomb may have been turned into a kind of makeshift Everjail. Either a jail or a hiding place seem to be the only two sensible options. Let me know what you think in the comments. This catacomb also has crabs and giant crabs, plus the axe of Rosas, the Usher of Death, and a figure centrally connected to death. The interweaving of death here is absolutely everywhere, so it's a really fitting place for a cemetery shade, and the connections to Godwyn really cement the relationship between the shades and the Prince of Death. As I have already said, it's somewhat hard to say one way or the other how this connection is meant. I have been leaning on the crab spider being the operative connection to death, but it could as well be something about the humanoid entity it controls. If any of its attacks had Deathblight, we would have more evidence to speculate a direct line of influence from Godwyn. We can still do so now, but with less confidence and more uncertainty about how this influence is coming about. In my mind, there are too many coincidences for the connection to not be something material. And while I've said that it could be through the body, the connections that the insect has seem to be of much more consequence, making that the more likely route of influence. And just while I was writing this script, Zullie released another video that brings up some more Deathblight and Godwyn connections with insects. With this in mind, I feel safe concluding that the head parasite crab spider is the connection to death and its prince. Plus, with all those flies around Godwyn's soulless body, an insect connection is hard to dispute. Coming to the end of what we can learn about these shadows, there's simply not as much to reveal as in the case of the Lookout Stones. We already have a name for them, and we are given an explicit title in terms of what they do. There are also a much smaller number, and they occupy fewer places. Still though, we have seen connections that are not immediately apparent during a normal run of the game. The parasitic spider crab is just the tip of the insect-ridden iceberg. These shades are tied to Death and Godwyn in a number of ways, from protecting his entourage to maybe hunting down his killers. They seem so acutely placed in these areas that a will or consciousness guiding them is hard to rule out. They also have their familial connections to the kindreds, but we see that the different paths of elemental influence have irreversibly changed both sets of creatures. From the Prince of Death to Pests of Rot, the cemetery shades, like the Lookout Stones, have quite a few more connections than meets the eye. In terms of what there is that's conclusive to say about them, I think I've covered everything in this video. That said, getting the concrete down is only half the fun, so I'm interested to hear what connections seem plausible or what other theories you have about the shades after hearing all of this. Please feel free to present your thoughts and theories in the comments. You can also subscribe to the channel to stay up to date and become a patron on Patreon if you really enjoy the content I make. There is more of it to come, both in lore and broader game design discussions. With that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in one of those future videos. Peace.